And welcome to this edition of Hidden History, Stories from the Secret City. I'm Keith McDaniel, along with my co-host, Ray Smith. Good afternoon, Ray. How are you?
Hey, I'm okay, Keith. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. It's fall break. I'm out for a week of school, and I'm just relaxing a little bit. I probably should be doing a whole lot more work than I've been doing this week, but that's all right. Hey, we got a couple of special guests with us today. So,
Yeah,
Ray, why don't you introduce them for us?
we surely do. We have Dr. Judith Stauber with us from the Los Alamos-Japan Institute, and we have Clifton Truman Daniel, good friend from the Truman Presidential Library. And Clifton and I met, I was just looking a little while ago, Clifton, in 2013. You were in Oak Ridge, and we had an event at the New Hope Center at Y12, and I got acquainted with you at that point. And I'm glad to say we've stayed in touch over the years. And you were the one, I believe, that introduced Judith to me, saying that she should see me when she came to Oak Ridge. And we had a good tour, didn't we,
And
Judith?
that
I think
was
we
a
enjoyed.
year ago this week
Yeah.
or so, or just about
Okay.
exactly a year ago. I know how beautiful Oak Ridge is this time of year.
Yeah, it is.
Nice.
You're right. I was just driving. I went to Gatlinburg just last week. By the way, Keith, I went to Gatlinburg and went to the uh, the treetops, Anakista. Couldn't think of it,
Yeah.
and went to the Sky Bridge. So I don't have to go back to Gatlinburg for a long time. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to do just fine seeing pictures of it. I tell you that. So
Judith and Clifton, what we're talking about is, bless our hearts, in the fall of the year, you can't stir them with a stick in Gatlinburg. There's so many people up there, and that's great. Oh, by the way, they just had a bad fire up there in downtown last week,
yeah.
but I was gone, so I didn't start it.
All right.
But they've had a really good year this year, and Gatlinburg and Pigeon Forge are both just booming this time of year. The leaves are pretty. They're beginning to change. It's been a little dry, but I think we're going to have a pretty fall. Okay, Judith, let's start with you and let you talk to us about the Los Alamos Japan Institute.
I'd be glad to, but you just
little
mentioned,
yeah, you can talk a little bit about Oak Ridge too.
yeah, well,
Right.
you mentioned Pigeon Forge, and I'm ready for Dollywood anytime you are.
Oh,
Up there.
okay. Yeah, that's
Big
great.
fan of Dolly. So
Good.
thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Los Alamos Japan Institute builds bridges. We do conversations like we're having right now across people who live in atomic communities around the world and in other places of conscience. That's the language we use for thinking about what it is to live in these places, where I've lived in Los Alamos for 8 years, and you're all in Oak Ridge, and people who live in Hanford. It's a different lifestyle, and it's a different kind of backdrop for doing work. I was the history museum director in Los Alamos for 8 years, and had a chance to really see how we communicate these histories, and how do we draw audiences in, and how do we promote conversation with increasingly more inclusive audiences, ideally. And that's really our focus, is really building bridges across people who may or may not come across one another in their walks of life naturally. And maybe the conversations are challenging or nerve-wracking to some. And we think that's a good thing, because that's how we know we're alive. And we want to bring people together in real ways. So I look forward to our next visit to Oak Ridge, because LAJI is interested in building those bridges in person. You know, we are visiting museums and communities and sharing stories and finding those parallels. There's a lot of wonderful parallels between Los Alamos and Oak Ridge, but there's also surprising parallels to be found between these places in the US and cities like Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Kyoto. So I spent a couple of years and after building bridges in Japan, between Los Alamos and Japan, and traveling from Los Alamos to Japan. And after that second trip, which was in 2017, things really came together. There was so much openness and welcome. I was embraced in Nagasaki and embraced in Hiroshima and made very easy connections to Kyoto, which was also a target city early on. So there's a lot of history there, and there's a lot of personal experiences to be shared that are really unique. And that's what we do. So when I came back from that second trip in 2017, my colleagues who I had been spending time with in Japan from Hiroshima were in Chicago at, of all places, the Japanese Cultural Center in Chicago, an Aikido center that was turned into an exhibit for a whole month. And this was an exhibit that was traveling around from Hiroshima and Nagasaki to points in the US and in Europe and in other places. And while there, and while taking Japanese colleagues out for sushi in Chicago, someone said, "Do you know who lives in Chicago?" And I said, "Who?" And it wasn't until then that I found out about Clifton. So I met Matsuhiro Sasaki and Clifton in the same sort of 6-month period, which really shaped where we went for the next 5 years. And in 2018 with Clifton, when Clifton and I connected very easily, a lot of shared vision. In Hebrew, the word is bashert, sort of meant to be connection. Corporate language would be, we are well aligned. And so we thought, hey, here's a great opportunity to do something new and innovative that some people honestly aren't brave enough to take on because it's sometimes pretty hard. And we've embraced challenge with open hearts. And that's what Clifton and I founded together, the Institute, in 2018. And since then, we've been having conversations like this with Ray, with, we talked about the International Friendship Bell in Oak Ridge, those points of connection where cultures come together. That's what we're really interested in. So
yeah, and I remember the impact that bell had on you when you were there in Oak Ridge. You see, it probably your perception of the bell is so different than mine. I'm so close to it. I'm so accustomed to it. I've been through the controversy. I know the history. I'm proud of what we've created there. Yeah, and you saw that. You didn't see the 1990s controversy, but you saw the Peace Pavilion and where it is now. And I think you saw it with just a bit of envy, in that you'd love to have something like that in Los Alamos.
So there's a lot to be proud of. And
yeah.
That's what makes those public memorials or displays or contemplative spaces that much more engaging, knowing the stories behind it and hearing, Ram Upuluri is a member of our board now. He's on the LAJI board, which was a connection that we made through discussing his family's initiation of the bell and the story there. But yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of symbols of peace in Los Alamos. That's true. And people have tried in the past to do different kinds of things. Those are valuable conversations.
Do you find, let me ask a question real quick. Do you find that as the years pass by, it gets any easier for maybe the attitudes are not as strong as they once were, or maybe people are a little bit more open to that conversation that you're trying to have?
You want to jump in, Clifton? I mean,
I hadn't even been introduced here. I'm not sure I'm supposed to have an opinion yet.
Okay, so you certainly can chime in. I think the peace, and I'm calling it the Peace Bell because that's what I thought it was for a very long time, and that's a really interesting issue because it's called the Friendship Bell. And so I think that under really challenging conditions, people are comfortable with language like understanding and friendship, but that peace gets put into a different category, whether that's because these are communities that are producing wartime goods and not in the business of peace necessarily, I think it's been all over the place. I've been inspired mostly, Keith. I've been inspired by people's openness. I've been particularly inspired by people in Japan's openness to someone from Los Alamos coming and trying to make peace with them. And that was never an issue. I was welcomed really quite warmly. There were more challenges back in Los Alamos. And it's personal. You know, people are working hard every day to defend the nation, and they believe in the work they're doing, and they're doing good work, and they don't want to feel bad about it. And I certainly don't want to make them feel bad about it. But I want people to talk and be real and open and challenge themselves to learn maybe something about another person, about themselves.
Well, that was very, and in Oak Ridge, that was the attitude that's what I heard from the late Bill Wilcox, Ray,
Yeah.
Keith, because I wound up asking the question, of course, you know, how did everybody in Oak Ridge feel when they learned of the destruction caused by the bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki? And Bill's answer was very similar. He said nobody gloried in that. Nobody wanted that. What we wanted was an end to the war. Every one of us had someone in service. Every one of us had a brother, an uncle, a father, a son fighting. We had friends, family. We wanted it to stop. Wanted the dying to stop. So it's, you know, you continue the work, you're defending, you're doing the work that defends the country, that keeps us safe, but you don't glory in what that defense sometimes has to do.
You know, when I made my first documentary, Secret City, the Oak Ridge Story, The War Years, one of the questions, I interviewed probably 100 people for that film. And many of them were folks that had come here during the Manhattan Project, during the 40s, and worked on the project. And I made it a point to ask at the end of, usually at the end of the interview, how did you feel once you found out what the project was, what you were doing? And I had one fellow who kind of summed it, and this was a universal, almost a universal feeling. And I think this clip is actually in the film. The guy said, "I'm proud we did it." He said, "No," he says, "I'm not proud we did it." He said, "But it was a job that needed to be done, and I'm glad we did it well." And that was pretty much the universal feeling of those people, at least the ones that I talked to, that were involved in that project.
And we had a similar, when I was after I came back from Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 2012. Some years after that, I met a man named Orville Amdahl. He's gone now, sadly, but lived, I think, to be 94, 95 years old. Orville was a Marine captain during the war, and he and his men fought their way all the way across the Pacific. And they were off the coast of Nagasaki at the end. And that was where that's where they were scheduled to land in the invasion, in the planned invasion at the harbor of Nagasaki. And Nagasaki is a deep river valley. There are hills all around it. There were guns in all those hills. And the Japanese were capable of just raining shells on the harbor as Orville and his men came ashore. And they were all rewriting and writing their wills. And Orville did not. He was terrified. The bombs dropped, the war ended. They were all greatly relieved. And they came ashore at Nagasaki a few weeks later as one of the early occupational forces. And Orville was sick by what he saw, by the destruction, just heartsick at what he saw. And he was encouraged to take a souvenir, a sword. They had hundreds of them that they had taken away from officers. And Orville sent one home. He didn't want to, but the quartermaster kept pushing everybody because they were going to throw them all in the ocean if they didn't. So Orville sent the sword home. He put it in the closet. He didn't hang it up. He didn't use it as a trophy. He didn't take it out and wave it around for house guests. He had a devil of a time keeping it away from his children and his grandchildren. And finally, after he retired, long after he retired, he went through the motions, went through a sister city commission, Nagasaki and St. Paul sister city, and found the son of the Japanese officer who had to give up that sword. And Orville wrote to him and returned the sword. The man, Mr. Motomura, Tadahiro Motomura, came to the United States with his 2 sons and his wife, and they had a ceremony, and Orville formally gave him back his father's sword.
Mm.
As far as attitudes go, that ceremony was packed. It was on television stations throughout the Minneapolis, St. Paul area. There was lots of coverage. And 2 weeks later, I called the writer, Karen Stelson, who arranged for all of that. I said, well, now that's all over. You can relax, right? And she said, no, for the last 2 weeks, I've been getting phone call after phone call, people wanting to return swords. So it's good. So to mirror what Judith said, the attitude has been very encouraging.
And those people's stories are so moving for those of us who might not find ourselves engaged in them. And what's been challenging and interesting, and I think we've been quite successful, is communicating amongst communities that are secret places where communication is coded, not direct, and it's an interesting milieu to be doing this kind of work in. And so it's not in people's comfort zone generally. But I do think, our communities are changing. This was 80 years. Los Alamos is a different place 80 years later than it was in 1945. And there's openness, and that's inspiring. And places, those symbolic places that visitors can come and see are really important. So why I was so excited about the bell in Oak Ridge is that it tells a different part of the story than one might expect to find in Oak Ridge. And the assumptions that we make when we go visit our atomic cities in the US, or even when we go and visit places in Japan and in other places around the world, it's inspiring to see other pieces of the stories, so that we can put together a whole picture that's more truthful.
It's interesting that, and of course, I live in Oak Ridge, and I grew up in the shadow of K-25, just really literally. So I've been here my whole life for the most part. And in my involvement the last 25 years or so in recording and telling the history of Oak Ridge, the thing that I have discovered that is most startling, I think, is the fact that when people outside of Oak Ridge think of Oak Ridge, they only think of one thing. And Oak Ridge, there's a million other stories about technology and scientific advancement and all these things that Oak Ridge has been a part, and world peace, helping stabilize, the country, after the fall of the Soviet Union. It's just an amazing place to be. It really, really is. And especially if you know about those things. And of course, Ray does a fantastic job of sharing all that information, way better than any of the rest of us, to be quite honest. And that's the Oak Ridge that I want people to know.
Don't forget about fly fishing on the Clinch River.
Oh yeah, that's true. So,
yeah. I think my hook's still caught in a tree somewhere.
Yeah.
That's an interesting thing about, you mentioned the Clinch River. Oak Ridge was plopped down into the middle of Appalachia in the 1940s. A large number of people with high education, cultural differences than the surrounding area. And over the years, there's been an interesting change that's taking place. For many years, Oak Ridge was an outreach to several of the Appalachian communities, with free medical clinics, one example, educational programs, and just influenced the area significantly. Not to mention the economic impact. The best jobs in the Southeast are right here in Oak Ridge, have been and still are today. But an interesting thing is happening over the years. The population has changed. It was 75,000 during the Manhattan Project, went down to about 30,000, got as low as 27,000, but then it's back up to 32,000 now. And an interesting thing is if you look at the free and reduced lunches in schools, you'll note that 10 to 15 years ago, there were almost none. Now they're about 60%. So the population is changing. A lot of service workers are moving into these homes that are original Manhattan Project homes that are still here 80 years later.
Mhm.
But the schools have done a tremendous job. Oak Ridge is still one of the best schools in the nation, even including the kind of changes they're having to deal with. And oh, by the way, I think that Oak Ridge is on the cusp of another major shift in scientific discovery for the world. I mean, we have a small modular reactor that's being built on the K33 site in the East Tennessee Technology Park, the old K25 site. And it's a demonstration of the kind of nuclear power that I think is going to be rampant in a few years. So Oak Ridge, as Keith said, Oak Ridge continues to provide that amazing kind of technological advances that are helping worldwide. Nuclear medicine. There's even a organization building out at that same location that will produce radioisotopes. And the same thing could be said, Judith, for Los Alamos. I mean, it hasn't stood still at all. There are tremendous changes taking place there. What is the population of Los Alamos now? Is it about 19,000?
It was about 18 last I checked.
Okay.
But
Something
there's
like that.
about close to 12 employees working at the laboratory, something like this.
Yeah.
So
well, now that's interesting. I've known the laboratory has always been a high number. Oak Ridge Y12 is now up to around 7,000 people, and the Oak Ridge National Laboratory is in the 6,000, approaching 7,000. So
yeah,
again, 12 to 14,000 people working at these locations, and we draw them in Oak Ridge. We draw them from 20 counties. So the economic impact of Oak Ridge to East Tennessee is just tremendous.
yes, it's true in northern New Mexico as well. That's true.
It is.
So you're making a great sell for visiting Oak Ridge, which is something that Clifton and I, during the pandemic, when we weren't able to visit too much, we spent a lot of time thinking about how can we kind of expand these ideas, and the travel programs that we're coming up with are really the outcome of those conversations. So we really want to do domestic travel and international travel. So LAJI trips to Oak Ridge, we all go to Hanford together, come to Los Alamos. I mean, it's so wonderful to sort of share those like connections, but then also really different kind of travel. So this year, Ray knows, in May, we're launching our very first global trip, and it's to Israel. And it's to Israel, because Clifton can tell you a bit more about this, because President Truman, Clifton's grandfather, was there at the beginning of the formation of the state. And there's some wonderful stories about President Truman meeting Israeli officials in Independence and other places that Clifton will share on our trip, and maybe a little today. But we're really excited to celebrate Truman's Israel legacy. So we'll be doing that in May. And Ray's going to be coming along. So we also have a few other people from Oak Ridge already signed up.
We do, and I'm very happy that
it's exciting.
Your idea about promoting it seems to have worked, at least for a few people in Oak Ridge. So I'm glad to be a part of that. Clifton, tell us a little more about the history associated with that and what we're going to be doing on that trip.
The Israel trip. I think what Judith was alluding to, also the famous story, and certainly through my family, is
this is a trip teaser.
Excuse me.
This is a trip teaser.
Trip teaser. Okay, it took me a second. I'm glad I trip teaser. Okay, good.
Sorry.
Anyway.
Come on, give him a break. He's just had COVID, so he's a little
COVID.
slow right now.
I'm trying to stay focused here.
Yeah.
No, the family story. Grandpa had an old friend, one of his best friends, named Eddie Jacobson, and they met in Kansas City when Eddie was 15 and Grandpa was 22. There was a 7-year age difference, but they saw something in each other and they hit it off. They didn't really run into each other again until World War I, basic training, where they together ran the only successful canteen on at Camp Doniphan at Fort Sill in Lawton, Oklahoma. Every other canteen lost money, fell apart, but Grandpa and Eddie had retail and banking experience at that point, and they knew what they were doing. So after the war, they went into business together. Sadly, the haberdashery they opened failed due to the post-war recession. And Eddie stayed in the business, went on the road selling shirts, and Grandpa became a county judge, went into politics, what started his career. They stayed close friends for the rest of their lives. Eddie never took advantage of the fact that Grandpa was a judge or a senator, vice president, or president. He just didn't ask for anything. He was that kind of guy. Finally, though, Grandpa had been beset by various factions in the run-up to the recognition of the new state of Israel. He'd been getting it from both sides, but getting it from his own State Department, George Marshall, who did not want him to do that for fear of upsetting the Arabs and the oil. And then you had the Jewish population in this country pushing for him to recognize Israel. So he was getting pushed and pulled from both sides, and he finally had had enough, and he refused to see or talk to anybody. Eddie was convinced to go and see Grandpa and see if he could get him to agree to see Dr. Chaim Weizmann, who's representing the new state. And Grandpa, Eddie went over to the White House. He was, I think, the only person, or one of the only people, who could get in to see Grandpa without an invitation. He could just show up and sit in the outer office and wait until Grandpa had a break, and which is what he did. And he went in to see Grandpa to talk to him about Weizmann. And after a couple of minutes of polite catching up, he brought up the subject of Israel and Weizmann. And Grandpa was furious. He didn't want to hear it. And Eddie wrote that Grandpa used all sorts of language, and Eddie said that at no point did he ever think that this was the closest he ever saw his friend Harry Truman come to being an anti-Semite. Grandpa was really mad. And Eddie didn't know what to do. Grandpa sat down in his desk chair and swiveled away, wouldn't face Eddie, swiveled away to look out the window. And Eddie frantically looked around the room for something, anything to give him an idea how to go on. And his gaze landed on the statue of Andrew Jackson, Grandpa's favorite president. And he said, "Harry, you have a hero, Andrew Jackson. I have a hero, Chaim Weizmann. I think he's the greatest Jew who ever lived. He's an old man, he's sick, and you won't see him. That's not like you." And Eddie said then that Grandpa started drumming his fingers on his desk, which Eddie knew from past experience was Grandpa changing his mind. Finally, Grandpa swiveled around in his chair and he said, all right, you bald-headed SOB, you win, I'll see him. And he did. So that's the family story behind that. There were many other factors, obviously, that went into the recognition of Israel, but certainly Grandpa was the first to grant it, 11 minutes after midnight.
Right. In those final hours in May of 48, he was the first phone call.
All right.
Yeah.
What a tremendous story. Hey, and tell us about the trip that we're taking in May of 23.
Oh, yeah,
Right.
that's more, as far as nuts and bolts go, that is Dr. Stauber.
Well, we can tag
I am
team.
what's known as talent.
That's what he said.
I am along for the ride. This, Judith will give education and tell a story, Clifton. So,
I've been there. I know what you're doing.
I will have, we're going to, from my end of this, just briefly, before I turn it over to Judith, from my end of this is the Truman history and the political history behind this, including the story of Eddie Jacobson. But there's a lot more to it than that, as I said. So that's what I will bring to the table, is family stories, Truman history, with help from my folks at the Truman Library.
Yeah, wonderful. I mean, that's the theme of the trip. It's going to be 8 nights in Israel, and every day there will be a theme that will intersect with Truman history, a chance for Clifton to tell stories, but also a chance to meet with other scholars and educators in Israel, including the folks at the Truman institute in Jerusalem at Hebrew University, which is really exciting. And we will be in Israel in early May. And one of the things we get to celebrate is President Truman's birthday on May 8th. So that'll be a special day of all kinds of things, including Clifton's performance as his grandfather in the play Give 'Em Hell Harry that he's been performing around the country. He's taking it to Israel for the first time. And we're really excited. It'll be really exciting for the group to be together on the bus, touring around Israel and sharing stories. And we'll be based in Haifa in the north for 4 nights, and then Jerusalem for 4 nights. And from those 2 places, Israel's a very small country, about and maybe smaller than New Jersey. So you can really get around from those points north and central. And in 8 days, pack in a lot of wonderful visits and conversations on historic sites, and visit holy places like the Western Wall and the Baha'i temple and gardens that are in Haifa. That's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. I mean, Israel is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And it's just remarkable, from mountains to sea, food and music. We'll get it all in, and I promise a wonderful time.
Well, I'm sure looking forward to it. That's for sure. I really am. Clifton, talk about the Truman Institute a little more. I didn't know that you had a location in Israel. So tell us about it.
That's I understand the confusion, because they are both called the Truman Institute, but that it's the Truman Institute in Israel is a separate. They're not. In fact, I've been sort of trying email exchanges to start the ball rolling to talk to them about doing the play and about visiting them when we go on May 8th. But the Truman Library Institute in Independence, Missouri, is essentially the fundraising arm of the Truman Presidential Library and Museum. It's the board of directors, the nonprofit board of directors. I'm the honorary chairman. And we have just, as a matter of fact, we have just gotten back from where we caught COVID, which was Washington, D.C., unveiling Grandpa's statue in the Capitol Rotunda.
Oh my!
That was done through the Institute. We did that September 28th. Polly and I were in Washington for that. And upcoming events. For example, we've got President George H.W. Bush's paintings. In fact, that exhibit opens at the library today.
How exciting!
Portraits of Courage. Portraits in Courage.
Nice. The Truman Institute in Jerusalem, I'll just add, is it's a Center for Peace and Conflict Resolution. It's an academic department at the university. And it seems to be a place where people have joint appointments, and they have a lot of interns and conferences and some wonderful policy work going on around peace and conflict, in a place that really could use some great academics at tackling that issue.
And I'm glad to hear of that. And I think it's tremendous that Truman's name's attached to it. I really think that's neat to see that in Israel. That's great.
One of the most exciting things for Clifton and I has been when we meet with our Israeli counterparts and organizers and speakers and have these Zoom meetings, the initial excitement never goes away. Truman is beloved to this day in Israel, from everyone that we talk to, which is really wonderful and inspiring.
I'm sure it is. Well, and I might ask you to also mention the 2024 trip that you're planning for Japan into, I think, 3 cities that we're going to. I'm going to song on that one too.
So that is our hopeful potential plan for 2024. No promises, but yes. I mean, this was something that we had wanted to do for the 75th anniversary in 2020. And like lots of people who had great ideas for 2020, we had to table it. And so we'd like to bring it back. I mean, we're going to do Israel first, and then our hope is to be able to make that happen. And yes, that would be a trip to Hiroshima, to Nagasaki, to Kyoto, to meet our colleagues. LAJI's advisory board, over the last few years, we have built up and expanded, and there are representatives of all of these places on our board. So there are our colleagues and our friends, and we're always interested in meeting new people there. And I'll say among the surprising things, things that you're surprised about when you come to these places, there's a remarkable amount of science to be had in museums in Japan. And that was one of the things that really struck me, to see a kind of grappling with what happened to them, and to try to understand that, and then to put that on display. Wow, it's surprising. So, we know what science museums look like in the United States. And when you go to Hiroshima, especially, but also to Nagasaki, there's a surprising amount of science in museums that aren't presented as science museums.
Well, and all of those, the museums in Oak Ridge and Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Los Alamos, having visited all of them, they all have one very important thing in common, is that it is a straightforward, factual retelling of events. There's no politics. There's none of that. There's no finger pointing. It's just what happened and how it happened and what were the aftermath, which I think is a remarkable thing that all four sites share.
Yeah.
And all four sites also share now, a little more than they used to, share both sides. We've done that at the Truman Library. We now have the atomic bomb exhibit, for example, we have the arming plug for the Nagasaki bomb for Fat Man, and as well as a tiny paper crane folded by a little girl, Sadako Sasaki, who was sickened and died from radiation after the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. So, and we have interviews there's in the corner of the exhibit, you can sit down and watch testimony from Japanese, Americans, and it goes both ways. You have Americans for and against it. You have Japanese for and against it, but you have survivor testimony in there, some of which my son Wesley and I recorded when we visited Japan in 2013.
Wow.
Yeah.
Right after going to Oak Ridge, we went. We were in Oak Ridge, and I was in Oak Ridge in March, I think, Ray, February, March.
Yeah, was in
And
March.
Wes and I were back in Japan in June.
Yeah.
Our friends in Kyoto at the Kyoto Museum of World Peace, their language is facing the past honestly. And that's what this is. When we're seeing museums do renovations like I did in Los Alamos and like just happened in Independence, with those renovations comes a kind of a more willingness to look at more inclusive stories, different ideas and different points of view. And for American audiences, I'll say, if you go to the museums in Hiroshima and Kyoto with us or on your own, you're not going to be attacked and blamed, because the same kind of thing is happening there. There's a lot of self-reflexiveness. There's a lot of looking at Japan's own role in acts of aggression, which is something that you might be surprised to think about. Are Japanese looking at their own behaviors? Yeah, they are. And that's how a museum is relevant, has respect for its audiences, and is really doing the right thing because it's creating critical thinking and letting people know they have a place in that story too, about how to make sense about history.
Another aspect that's happened since 2015, November of 2015, we formed the Manhattan Project National Historical Park, 3 locations, Hanford, Los Alamos, and Oak Ridge. By the way, I just met with the acting superintendent.
Yes.
And she was in Oak Ridge last week, and I had got to spend some time with her. I think she's gonna be a good. I'm hoping she's going to be appointed permanently, but she's acting right now. At any rate, well, yeah, the formation of that park, I believe, has strengthened that balance of presentation that we're making. I think, and it was unfortunate in my mind, but even back when we were talking about the park, it took 10 years to get it into being. And along that time, there was a good bit of what I would call revisionist history coming out about, really, did we need the bombs, and really, did they cause the end? Some of it was ridiculously, obviously misleading, but others had some insights that we needed to examine and think about. And I think we're doing that now. I think we've had a pendulum swing, and now we're coming back more centric. And I'm proud of the things that are being done. I'm just learning about what's happening in Japan from you, but I'm glad of what I know about what's happening here in the U.S., especially in Los Alamos, Hanford, and Oak Ridge. Well, Keith, we've had a good session today. Thank you all, both of you, for being with us and spending time talking about the things you're involved in and that we're mutually engaged in. I really, really do appreciate you being with us, both of you.
Absolutely.
Thanks for
Yes,
having me.
Thank you.
all.
What fun.
Thank you all so much. All right, Ray, who do we have lined up for our next one?
We've got Shirley Raines coming next time. She's written a book, An Uncommon Journey, about, it's a leadership book, about her journey from being a teacher, I think a lower grade teacher, I'm not sure, but a teacher, to becoming the president of a university, and how she made that evolution in her career. She's also written some books about nature, about butterflies, about birds. So she'll be an interesting person for us to bring on with an Oak Ridge connection, especially out at the Arboretum. You can see some of the pictures from her books that are on the hiking trails there. So we'll have Shirley with us next time.
All right. All right. And thank you all so much again. And folks, thanks for watching. And we'll see you again in a couple of weeks.